there was this article by Global Times, and it's been in the news for the last week or so about the de-dollarization of the US dollar and the de-dollarization of it. But also, this article said, but the de-weaponization of the dollar is actually more urgent. Dr. Rod, what are both of those terms and why are they important to us?
Well, you've got to love the media, haven't you, for inventing new terms, tongue twisters at that. And
Yes.
Obviously, not too many people are going to understand what it's all about. They're new words. And, you create a new language, you suddenly become an expert. So forgive me for being a little bit skeptical of what's going on in the media. But look, the two terms are a little bit similar because they are describing two things that are happening in the world today. De-dollarization, that really is about the reduction in the use of the US dollar for international trade purposes and also as holding as a foreign currency reserve. So every country that's involved in trade has to pay for their imports and to receive payments for their exports. And from about the end of the Second World War until fairly recently, the US dollar was the most popular currency in which to do trade. So countries paid for their imports using US dollars and they received payment for their exports primarily using US dollars. There are some other fairly major currencies as well, including pounds, the pound sterling, and a few other currencies. Now, because countries pay for and receive payment for their exports in US dollars, they also have to hold reserves of US dollars. And that essentially is like a deposit in the, but it's held in terms of the US dollar.
And now, is that in a US bank that's held in?
No, it doesn't have to be. No, it doesn't have to be in a US bank. It can be anywhere, really. So what's been happening in recent years is that a number of countries have got together and they've come to agreement that instead of using the US dollar for their trade transactions, they will use some other currency.
Yep.
And some quite large economies, including China, India, Brazil, and a few others, have come to agreements to use their own currencies to settle their trading transactions with one another. And as a result, there's less demand now for United States dollars for the purposes of trade. And over the last 30, 40 years or so, the quantity of the world's reserves of foreign currencies held in US dollars has fallen from around 85% to just under 60%. So roughly a 25 percentage point reduction. Now, de-weaponization, on the other hand, that's a much more difficult concept to grasp. And I hope I'm beginning to understand it. But you will know that often when there is some dispute going on in the world, and the most recent example would be the war in Ukraine, the United States and sometimes the international organizations have led boycotts or restrictions on trade. And in a sense, that means that the US dollar is being used as a weapon. So making it impossible for Russia, for example, to engage in payment for international trade using US dollars. That's weaponizing the US dollar in a sense.
Yes, so explain that to me for a minute, because I understand that concept is US then took away their, like, Russia's reserves, how did that work?
Well, what you can do is freeze any US dollars that are held in US banks, for example, so that if governments or large corporations are holding US dollar deposits inside the United States, they can't use that money. So that's the sense in which the US dollar can be used as a weapon. Now, one of the problems in using the US dollar as a weapon is that it makes the United States dollar a less reliable currency in which to do international trade.
Yeah.
So those two are connected. And as nations see the dollar being used in a sense as a weapon, they are becoming more and more reluctant to use the US dollar to settle their international trade transactions because of the fear that they might not be able to use any reserves of US dollar currencies that they hold. So
is that the only reason why they're moving towards this like de-dollarization, or is
no, it's
it
not the
also
only.
because the American dollar is now kind of not as stable as it used to be?
You're right. And any currency is only useful in international trade if it itself has a stable value. That requires that the host nation, as it were, have a relatively low rate of inflation, which of course isn't the case at the moment. And
Yep.
there's no end in sight because the government is utterly incapable of restraining spending under the Biden administration, and actually under really basically since the days of Reagan. The federal government in the United States has found it virtually impossible to seriously rein in spending. And so more and more dollars are literally printed, and that was particularly the case during COVID. And that must lead to inflation if the government is unwilling to rein in their own spending or to increase taxes. So that raises the issue of instability in the value of the US dollar, so it's less attractive. Now, interestingly enough, when the international monetary system was established after World War II, the British proposal was to actually establish a separate international currency, and that was to be used to settle international trade transactions. And part of it also would punish countries that run up large trade surpluses. Now, the Americans were against both. They wanted the US dollar to become the international currency, and they opposed the idea that countries that ran up large surpluses on their trading accounts should be punished for it. They rejected that idea. Now, the logic behind it was that if one or a few countries are recording very large surpluses on their international trade, that has to mean that there are other countries that are experiencing deficits on their trade.
Yeah.
Now, the system we ended up with, and you can blame America for this because they were obviously in a powerful political position after the Second World War, and they thought they were rigging the system in their favour. So they insisted on punishment for deficit nations, but not for surplus nations. And that's created all kinds of problems in the international monetary system, not the least of which is negative feelings of people in many of the low-income countries towards the United States and the higher-income countries in general, because they've had to make some very significant adjustments as they experienced chronic deficits on their international trading accounts. So, and ironically, the system has allowed countries like China to generate huge wealth by consistently running surpluses on their international trading accounts. So China has, in a sense, become very wealthy through the system that the United States established after the Second World War. It's really come back to bite them big time because it's allowed China now to have a massive influence throughout the world because they have built up such incredible economic power through consistently running trade surpluses. And there were no sanctions on China for doing that. There was pressure from time to time for them to make adjustments to the value of their currency in terms of US dollars and so on. But they really haven't been forced to do anything because the international monetary system, in a sense, benefits those who are running surpluses at the expense of those who are running deficits. Now, of course, the United States is running very large deficits on their trade accounts.
I'm gonna jump in for a second, Dr. Rob, because I thought I was following along, but now I don't think I am. This surplus and deficit idea. Can you talk me through a practical example? Like, give me
Yeah,
two
yeah, look,
countries and
Yep.
and how them. Yeah, deficit and surplus. What does that mean?
Well, if you, let's treat individual countries as if they're individual businesses for a moment.
Yep.
An individual business makes a profit by generating more income than it costs. All right? So the business has a surplus, we call that a profit. Now, when we're
Yep.
talking about two different countries that are trading together, a nation can generate income by selling goods and services overseas,
Yep.
but when it brings goods and services across its borders, that is what we call imports, it has to pay for them. Now, a
Yep.
country that is actually earning more by exporting goods and services than it is paying for the imports of goods and services, it runs a surplus.
So, like, let's talk about Australia and China, right? Australia, one of our big exports is let's just go basics, iron ore, right? Like we export a lot of minerals. Let's just break
That's
it down to
correct.
minerals.
Iron ore and
Let's
coal.
say
Yep.
let's say we export $100 million worth of iron ore to China, but we import $200 million worth of electronics from China. That means we're in a $100 million deficit and they're in a $100 million surplus. Is that
That's right.
what it? Yes.
That's how it works basically. And then you add that up across all of the countries around the world, and then you get a net surplus or a net deficit, and in some cases a balance. And
So it's
many
not
countries,
necessarily that they owe us the money or we owe them the money. It's not about who owes money. It's
no, it's
just
not really about
who
debt because
controls
because
the resources.
it's more about surpluses and deficits than it is about debt.
Okay.
Although a country that consistently runs a trade deficit will actually be running up debt because it's going to have to borrow to pay for the deficit.
Yes.
Okay.
That makes
And it
sense.
works a little bit similarly to the way it does, say, for businesses or for individual households. Now, a country which has lots of resources and lots of potential for development, like Australia, can actually run a deficit on its trading accounts for a long time, and Australia has done that for years and years and years, because there's still lots of development opportunities in Australia. Similarly for the United States, but they are running such large deficits now that people are starting to wonder, well, for how much longer will people be willing to hold US dollars? In other words, for how much longer will the United States actually be able to borrow from overseas in order to pay for the difference between its exports and its imports?
Yeah. Okay. So let's bring this back to this de-dollarization thing. So you're saying this surplus and deficit is actually part of this de-dollarization because that system was first set up in alignment with that dollarization system and making the US dollar the central currency to that?
Yes. After there was a meeting of mainly the victorious nations after the Second World War, and they met, among other things, to build a structure for international payments.
Yeah.
And the Americans had significant influence, and the ultimate agreement was essentially that the United States dollar would become the international currency. So as well as being the United States currency, it would also be the international currency.
Mm-hmm.
That, I think, was a mistake. They would have been better off running with the system that was recommended by the British, who wanted to set up a separate international currency. And look, there have been some attempts since then to do that through the international monetary system, through a system of what we call special drawing rights that would take us into an area which is probably not necessary and is very, very complex. But suffice to say, the Americans wanted that dominance.
Mm-hmm.
They won the argument at the time. I think it's now coming back to bite them.
So I hear people obviously listening to a lot of American podcasts and especially conservative or Republicans on that side. They're fighting for this. They say that the US dollar being the central currency is the best thing since sliced bread and everything like that, because, and I've heard these arguments, because they can make these sanctions on people. They can't. There has to be someone central. There has to be a good guy. That's kind of like what they say. There has to be a good guy that has the power to be able to punish bad behavior, such as what's happening in Russia and Ukraine and what like all that sort of stuff, and what happens in China and like that. What's your take on that? Because that's kind of leaning more into that de-weaponization kind of idea, isn't it? Like it. So, what's your thoughts on? There still needs to be a good guy. There still needs to be a referee. I suppose that's the term of it. So, what's your take on that?
I just think that it's been too one-dimensional, and that the idea of the international good guy, the democratic nation where people have freedom of speech and they have the ability to vote at many, many different levels. That's a great thing about America, the wonderful republic that is America. They've really tried very, very hard. I know they're flawed, and they've been seen in a sense as the international policeman. And people will vary in their opinions as to how good that has been for the world. My judgment would be that on the whole, it's been a good thing. However, you can't really decouple the good guy in terms of being international policeman from the good guy in terms of being a good husband, if you like, or good steward economically. And I think so.
Yep.
The problem that America has really is that it has not been able to demonstrate decent discipline fiscally for decades now, right? Because governments have decided that they can spend as much money as they like, effectively, and they do. They just keep spending. And sometimes, as was the case during the COVID period, they literally printed money. They didn't print physical money, but they literally printed money. Just because of the way the whole system works, you can actually create new money. And that's what's been happening in the United States for a long time. So as you keep on doing that, gradually people lose confidence in your currency because it no longer becomes a good store of wealth. So when you hold US dollar currency in reserves so that you can pay later on for your imports and so on, you really want to be holding a currency which is stable. In other words, its value remains pretty static over a long period of time. But if the United States keeps on spending, they run big government deficits, they either have to have a very high interest rate policy or they have a lot of inflation.
So let me jump on that point. What can I know that we're getting into real dream area here, so forgive me, but in an ideal world, is it possible for a government to stop spending? Like, is it feasible? Like, because a country still needs a run. Like it almost seems like that's just the norm. Is it actually possible?
Well, it was possible up until about the middle of the 20th century, when there were some very significant shifts in our understanding of how economies work. Yeah. And generally speaking, the argument that governments could run a deficit in order to offset unemployment during times of recession, that became widely respected and widely adopted. Now, the problem with it that we've observed, certainly in the latter half, or probably since about the 1980s, is that governments think, well, it's actually okay to spend all the time. That is, we don't have to worry about deficits anymore. And, well, it's just not true. because you can sustain, essentially, a government can sustain deficits as long as there's someone around the world who's prepared to pay for it.
Yeah.
It's been easy, perhaps, for the United States because of the fact that the US dollar has been an international currency, but that's becoming less and less true as time goes by. And look, I think some of what the conservative commentators are on about in the United States is nationalism as well. They want to see
Yes.
America strong in the world, and they
Yeah.
see this de-dollarization as evidence that the United States is becoming weaker in the world, and that's true.
Yeah.
I'm not sure whether they necessarily articulate that it's because they've been a bad boy,
Yeah.
in terms of their own internal economic management, and they're not the only government. I
Yeah.
think politicians have got the idea that it doesn't really matter if we spend money, because, and I don't think they recognise that it's their money. That people, when it's not your money to spend, I think you
Yeah.
tend to spend more, and I think
Uh-huh.
governments tend not to realise that when they spend money, they're taking it from somebody, either
So
directly through taxes or indirectly through inflation.
So let's say that there is a complete de-dollarization of the US dollar and they are no longer the central currency, the international currency. They used to be considered mighty and powerful because of their armed forces, which are now not as, they're not inserting their dominance as much as they used to, or people say that they used to, obviously fuel wars and things like that. What's the path forward for a nation like that when they lose their identity or lose their power in military and dollar? Does that mean they need to bring up their industries and exports? Is that what they need to be able to remain, a mighty nation?
Well, that's one way, but again, you don't necessarily do that by handing out government money.
Yep.
The best way is to keep inflation low, so that your costs are not increasing more rapidly than costs in other countries. So if you've got a high inflation environment, then all the costs of your inputs will go up. So exporting will diminish because your goods are becoming too expensive. Either that, or the income you earn is diminishing, which that's the sort of experience we have in smaller economies. So I think the long-term effect of de-dollarization will be that the United States is forced to do something about profligate government spending, because if they don't, they'll end up with very, very high interest rates that will just crush their economy. See, the problem is de-dollarization is partly a response to the weaponization of the dollar, right?
Yep.
But it's also partly a response to loss of confidence around the world that the United States is a responsible economic manager.
Yeah, well, I personally feel that power, not power, the downfall of that, because I live overseas, and whenever I transfer money, my business is in Australia, so I earn Australian dollars. Whenever I transfer money to here in the Dominican Republic, it has to go through a United States bank. Actually, it goes through two banks in the United States. And when I moved here like 2 years ago, we were at an exchange rate of about 74, 73, depending on the day, maybe a 72 cents in the dollar. Now I'm getting, I did a transfer the other day at like 61 cents, so I've lost over 10% of the value of my money just because the US dollar is not as powerful or as not as stable.
Well,
anymore.
that's more related to Australia. That's more related to the Australian currency losing its value against the US dollar, which is a slightly different thing altogether.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I thought it had to do with the inflation because obviously it all kind of happened around that time as that inflation
Because
happened.
ultimately, the US dollar will weaken. At the
Yeah.
moment, though, in a sense, the Australian dollar is weakening more than the United States dollar is weakening.
Okay. Yeah.
So the purchasing power of the Australian dollar internationally is falling. That's why you get less money when you transfer Australian dollars into your bank account in the Dominican Republic.
Okay. All right. The more you know, the more you know. Okay. So okay. But let's be honest, the world is losing confidence in the US dollar. It's
in a sentence, the world is losing confidence in the United States, and that's reflecting in their confidence in the dollar.
Yeah.
And you can guarantee with the President Biden's announcement that he's running for president again, it's going to make things worse, not better.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's hope that shifts. So, okay, thanks. So as leaders, we kind of just need to be aware of this stuff. That's why I wanted to have this conversation with Dr. Ryder. Just get understanding. This is happening in the world and it affects us as leaders. It affects our businesses. It affects the way we operate. So thank you, Dr. Rod, for sharing your experience in that. However, I just want to shift it just for a moment is what can we as leaders learn from this? And I suppose what I'm getting from this is be careful to be reliant on external forces, I suppose, or be reliant on external things. Try to become as independently reliable in our businesses because at the moment, all these countries to be able to do trade are reliant on the US dollar. And so if the US dollar is not as strong, if there's issues there, then that affects your trade. If you're not doing things the way the United States wants things done, then you're affected. And so that's to bring it back home to business leaders and ministry leaders as well. Wherever we're leading, we need to minimize our reliance on external things, except for reliance on God. Let me just emphasize that. We have to be completely independent, but completely dependent on God. Dr. Rod, how do we run our businesses as an entrepreneur, as a business leader, but also someone leading in a business, ministry leaders? How do we set ourselves up to minimize our reliance on external sources?
Oh, look, that's a tough one because so many businesses are involved in international trade. Here in Australia, of course, most businesses rely on imported inputs because in Australia, of course, we import a lot of our fuels. We import electronic devices. So every business is affected by what's happening internationally. But if we can just go really macro to start with, be careful how you vote. Right?
Oh, okay.
You need to make a judgment every time you go to the ballot box about which candidate associated with any particular party. You want to make sure that you've got to toss other things into this mix as well, but you need to take care that you vote for governments that are not just going to spray money around because it has long-term consequences. It will cause inflation, and that will weaken your currency, and that will ultimately make imports more expensive, and that's going to increase your costs. So just think really carefully about how you vote. And of course, there are other things you need to take into account as well in order to vote in a godly manner.
Yeah.
But the ballot box will actually determine the overall, if you like, economic environment, because there are usually one or a few parties that are far more conservative in the way that they deal with money than others. So that's something to keep in mind. The other thing is, if you are doing a lot of international transactions. There are some ways in which you can lock in exchange rates effectively, but you need to take advice on that. And as we often say on this podcast, get the best advice that you can afford. And if you're doing a lot of international transactions, then there are ways in which you can manage at least some of the risk associated with volatile foreign currency exchange rates.
Yeah. And there's some insurances and things like that. I know a lot of people that deal internationally. There's actually particular insurances that can that work to cover if the exchange rates drop and goods cost you more and things like that. So there are those sorts of things. That's really good. And please understand, I'm not saying that we all need to become what are those people that just go and live off the land and completely off the grid. And I'm not talking about that we just need to do that and not be reliant on anyone else. I just mean we need to be careful in who we're relying on. Are the sources that we're relying on reliable? I suppose is a good way to say it, and have wisdom in that. And I suppose talking about money, it's really important for us as leaders to make sure we're in a financial surplus, because it's only when we're not in that surplus that things affect us. Exchange rates, it dropped 10%, whatever. If we're already right on the edge of our finances, that 10% drop will affect our situation. Whereas if we've got surplus, it's like, yeah, that hurts our bottom line, but we're still in surplus, so we're good. If goods go up a little bit more, or a supplier has a little bit too much control over us, if we have surplus in finances, we can actually go to another supplier and maybe pay a little bit more, but we're no longer being held captive by a particular supplier or supply chain. That just make sure. I suppose the thing with this is, one thing that you actually started off saying, Dr. Rod, is like this surplus and deficit. I actually kind of like that if we as leaders make sure that we're always in surplus in all different areas of our life. I actually talk about margin, teach that in our leadership development program. Yes, our free leadership development program. Free shameless plug. It is down below, but the link is down below. But we need to have surplus in our energy, in our time, in our finances. We need to make sure we're in surplus, because if we're in deficit, that's when we are reliant on other people. When we're in deficit, that's when we are slave or chained to a particular person, a particular supplier, a particular situation. But when we as leaders are in surplus, that's when we are in control. So my encouragement to you as a leader, wherever you're leading, make sure you're in surplus. Hey, you've just watched an excerpt from the On the Cube Leadership podcast. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If it challenged your leadership or inspired you in some way, put a comment below. And if you want to watch the full episode or more content like this, check out our channel. And hey, consider subscribing while you're there.